Handwriting. It's handwriting.
Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to really think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Neil Almond.
Good to be back.
And Adam Smith.
Hello.
And the focus of our episode will be comparative judgment. But first, Neil, what you reading for?
Hey, what you reading for?
So I've chosen a blog this week, and it's a blog by Harry Fletcher Wood. It's called What's the Best Form of Professional Development? And it's one of those things where you read it expecting Harry to have done all the hard work and for him to tell you what to do. So within that, he looks at lesson study, he looks at instructional coaching, and he looks at teacher learning communities. And he effectively says, when you think about confidence intervals, all three options kind of do the same thing. But what's important is to look at the behavior changing mechanisms behind each of those items. And when you look at it through that lens of changing behavior mechanisms, it doesn't really matter what you do, as long as whatever you put in place has a certain amount of these behavior mechanisms. And depending on how many that you want will vary on what the actual output will be. So I found that really interesting, given the current landscape where instructional coaching seems to be king right now. Adam, what are you reading for?
Well, I had our first in-person conference of the MPQLT, Leading Teaching, I'm doing today. And it was lovely. It was at my school. There was a very good selection of sandwiches. And it was very nice to meet lots of people that I sort of know through Zoom. And we focused in the latter half of the session on different models of change and kind of looked at some that had been cribbed from the world of business that was kind of fine and interesting. And I've been thinking about organizations and things over the Easter holidays and reading a lot about finance. But ultimately, I just keep coming back to this EEF report that I'm really familiar with, which is putting evidence to work. A school's guide to implementation. And what I really like about that is it takes these quite generic models of change and implementation and leadership, and it actually just lays out how they work in a school, because a school is such a complex organism and quite a different environment really to any sort of for-profit organization. And yeah, I just really enjoyed re-familiarizing myself with some of the recommendations in that report, and especially thinking about legacy and thinking about how we had a head teacher come and visit who was been incredibly successful and very transformative, but she said herself she's approaching retirement age now, and a question for her of how she makes change sustainable. And I think that's something that's in that report. How do you sort of leave a school behind? How do you leave a project behind? How do you leave a curriculum behind? So yeah, that's my what you reading for. Kieran, what are you reading for?
They both sound fascinating. And I'm really looking forward to the day that my what you're reading for can be your RE book. How is writing going? Because it's going to be the seminal book on teaching primary RE.
To be honest, it's going to be the seminal book. So, when it comes out, how's it going? Slowly. It's difficult combining a job with a ridiculous sort of uneven workload, and I also have I have ADHD, which I kind of struggle to concentrate on big projects such as writing a full book. So it got pushed back. I did some writing over Easter. I will do more writing over the summer with an idea to getting it finished by the end of the summer, but that's what I said this time last year, and here we are. So yeah, it's coming along. Thank you. That's very nice of you to say.
It'll definitely be worth the wait, and it is a massive undertaking. My wife has asked me not to write any more books while the kids are still small, so so she understands what an undertaking is. I think that's a very sensible approach going for the big holidays, because you do have a bit more mental space, if nothing else. My actual what you're reading for is maths based, and it's if nothing else, it's really, really interesting, and it has some great sources to follow. And so it's called Using Diagrams as Tools for the Solution of Non-Routine Mathematical Problems. And it's by Marilena Panciara. And I recommend anyone get stuck in and then follow those sources. You know, I'm on this sort of rabbit hole within an exploration of non-routine mathematical problems and what they actually are. And then, yeah, this one I find myself underlining every couple of paragraphs and going, oh, that's really interesting. I haven't thought about that. So yeah, that's my what you're reading for. So a few weeks ago, we explored writing moderation on the podcast. And one of the sort of main threads was the idea that we might be better served through the utilization of a model that incorporated comparative judgment when assessing the quality of writing in primary. And I thought we need to follow this up more. And I know that Neil, in a previous role, you had utilized comparative judgment. And I know, Adam, you're utilizing it right now. And from what I've heard from both of you, to really good effect. And so I thought, who better to ask how we can get the most from comparative judgment? So I think, Adam, I'd like to start with you and ask you, what does comparative judgment mean to you?
Comparative judgment is essentially a system of moderation, and actually more than moderation, a system of assessing writing, which uses so much sort of volume of writing and so much volume of judgment that it creates a really reliable result. So what we do in our school is we use the Daisy Christodoulou's No More Marking, where they send a stimulus to the school. You know, it could be like an image, it could be a task that they have to complete. You know, it might be to write a book review, as a recent one, to write an article about pets, an image of sort of some caves. It's a stimulus, and then children get 2 lined pieces of paper, and they respond to that stimulus, and it's really freewheeling. They can respond, I would say, almost in any way. I mean, we would encourage them to respond in a way that's relevant to the stimulus. Then when there's a national window, which is the big sort of year, I think it's annually, I don't think it's termly, I think there's one judging window for each year group annually. Those get collated, scanned in, and then added to a national collection of writing. And then when so that all goes off to No More Marking, and then you get back this sort of judgment window. And it's for teachers, you get a link and you sit, and your screen is divided into 2 halves. And you have 2 pieces of writing that are presented almost like PDFs, and it's beguilingly straightforward. You literally just choose the better writing, and there's no it feels really almost too straightforward. You know, what the question at the top says, which is the better piece of writing, and you say left or right. Now, I've actually done the training in person with Daisy Christodoulou. When I started at my job, I did it just before COVID. I think we did it in February 2020. And there's a lot more to it than that. And we've done a lot of training in CPD at our school about how to effectively judge those pieces of writing. And I'm sure we'll get on later to some of the pitfalls with that sort of very simplistic system of judgment. But then the idea being that enough people judge those pieces of writing, and that, you know, A versus B, it's almost like an eye test, you know, which is better, A or B, and then they narrow it down and narrow it down and narrow it down until you have 2 very similar pieces of writing, and then maybe 50 teachers will judge those, and you can then say, well, that one marginally is better than that one. So you get back a standardized score, a bit like you do with the NFER, where there's been so much judgment and so much assessment done nationally that you can be this is like the best available assessment data. So you get back an age standardized score, and you might have, you know, your top writer would be 14.9. I'm in year 5, so, you know, we would hope they'd be an age 10 writing, and you might have a 14.9, and then you might have a 6.3 at the bottom. And yeah, essentially you get a rank of all your students. And then obviously you can see in primary, you can see you've got your greater depth, your expected standard, and you're working towards. And then we would moderate that before we sort of decided on those. I mean, it's, you know, I know it's beyond levels, but they're essentially levels, aren't they? And then we do internal tasks as well. So we have maybe 30 members of teaching staff. So it's the same principle, but obviously the results are less reliable, because instead of having 150 teachers, 200, thousands of teachers judging, you only have 30, but it's the same system and the same principle. You know, I think if you go to the training with Daisy, or you watch the videos, or you hear her talk about it, is very, the reliability factor is very convincing, because if you might have one teacher who is just sitting there judging on handwriting, it's weighed out by 50 teachers who are hopefully doing that. But again, we'll discuss some of the pitfalls later, I think, and some of the issues with it. So that is a little outline of comparative judgment. If you're interested in it, then it is No More Marking is the sort of brand name. I don't know if there's any other sort of generic options out there.
That makes a whole lot of sense, and it's based on the idea that as humans we are ill-equipped to make judgments, but we can more effectively make comparisons. I think that seems to be the underlying rationale behind it. And certainly, some of the things you're saying there, like the reliability, I think it goes a long way to play into our strengths as humans, and you're saying simple and almost too simple, and I think that's something that most teachers will sign up for. Certainly at 4 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon, you've got a choice between right and moderation or something that's deceptively simple. I know which one I would infinitely prefer to engage with.
I've never experienced the sort of old model of writing moderation. I did some in year 6 last year, looking at it with other schools, but I sat in the staff room the other day and heard horror stories of some of the forms and some of the sort of staying at school until 8 p.m. with stacks of English books or stacks of pieces of writing, and the nitpickiness of, has it met this standard? Have they used this particular piece of punctuation this way? So from my perspective, it is a vast improvement on anything that's sort of come before, and I personally have found it to be very successful. So if there's any trusts or schools out there thinking about whether it might be a good thing to implement, then I would suggest that it probably is, actually, on the whole.
I think it is a very powerful tool. And the more, and certainly whilst I was using it, the more you looked into it, the more you realized you could look into it pretty deeply and have a look at what was actually doing. So as Adam says, it's simply, left or right, but you get the ratio of left to right clicks. So you'll be able to see if a teacher has thought, I'm just really, really tired, I don't want to do this, so I'm just going to do all 50 judgments by just clicking right. Assuming you have like system level access to No More Marking, like you can see that it gives you an average time that teachers spent on the amount of judging that they have to do. So you can tell if someone's just whipped through it in 2 minutes, and then that's a conversation that you can have. The most interesting bit of data that I found, and perhaps most useful for senior leaders looking at how they can upskill teachers, is the part where each teacher gets almost like their own confidence interval for how accurate their judgments have been against the national standard. So if you have a case where you have your year 4 teacher's confidence interval is way below what's going on and what other people are judging nationally, then that's a really good way to have that conversation with that member of staff and thinking about what good year 4 writing might look like. So it's also a really good one that SLT need to be aware of as well. And when I was out of class, I always had to kind of check it myself just to make sure. You say a minute out of the classroom feels like a lifetime. So it's always kind of good to be like, well, actually, are my expectations vaguely where they need to be? And that can be a real useful kind of bit of self-reflection for yourself.
That sounds really, really useful. I think with the last episode and with what you guys have said so far, we've established that comparative judgment is something that we should encourage schools to do and to utilize. How can we get the most from it?
As a class teacher, you need to look in a bit more detail at the pieces of writing that are coming out. So when we do termly sort of data input for writing, and this is the backbone of it. We get our standardized scores through, and then we sit and have a meeting, or maybe it's not even a meeting really, maybe it's just me and my year partner sort of going over a spreadsheet, and we will sort of, I mean, it's sort of testament to how the system actually works, is that there are rarely that many surprises. So you would think if the system was unreliable, you would have to moderate it a lot. So you would find that your sort of greater depth writers were suddenly coming out at the lower end of expected standard, but that very rarely happens. You do have the odd time when a child, I mean, it's like any piece of assessment where a child has not felt very well that day or not felt like participating, and then you have to moderate it against their sort of English book and what they're capable of in class. We then take the pieces of writing that they do and we stick them in their English books as a sort of piece of published writing. And then we might, if there's time or wherewithal, to sort of sit and conference those with students and talk about what they've written and what kind of techniques they use. I'm of two minds as to whether this is, I don't think this is gaming the system, but we do talk about how to write an impactful piece of writing when they do comparative judgment. So one of the things that you will notice if you do a lot of it, and it makes complete sense, is that the first sentence and the first paragraph will be massively weighted in terms of the quality of that compared to the second page of writing, because I would say 90%, unless it's a really tricky judgment between two pieces, 99% of the time you're not going to read the second page of writing. Most teachers will again, I think the big elephant in the room that we will get to talk about is handwriting, and we'll talk about that later. But once you get past the handwriting, you might read the first sentence, the first paragraph, the first two paragraphs. So we would talk to students about using things like titles, subtitles. But again, I think we talk to the students about that when they do their sort of SATs writing anyway. We talk to students about that. So I'm not entirely convinced. I don't know whether that's quite gaming the system or not, really, but I think it's good. I think it helps them to think about how to construct a piece of work, helps them to think about how to lay things out, helps them to think about how to write for an audience, because ultimately they are writing for an audience. They're writing for a very large audience. And what I think Neil can talk to this a bit more, there's a whole host of resources that have now come out around comparative judgment that are really well constructed to address some of the very, very common problems with pieces of writing that come through, some of the reasons why they appear lower down in the ranking or why their writing age comes out lower, things around sentence construction and grammar, punctuation, spelling and things like that that have just come out. Now we've been trialing those in our school. I haven't been involved in it, but it's been trialed in, I think, in year 3 and year 4. And I will be using those later on this year, but I haven't had a proper look at them yet. But I think that it's really interesting that they're using a data-driven approach, or at least a research-driven approach, in terms of having this. Daisy Christodoulou is presumably the owner. I don't know if she really owns it, but her company has this huge data set of what year 1 writing looks like, what year 2 writing looks like, what year 3 writing looks like. And it's good to see that she's using that to kind of create things that are very tailored towards the issues she's found. And I think she would say she's done that partially as a response to COVID as well, and to some of the gaps that have appeared since COVID. I don't know if you know much about that, Neil, or if you know more about it than I do.
Only pretty much exactly what you've said. It's looked at writing and found those common denominators, which effectively comes to basic punctuation, I think, run-on sentences where, again, links back to the punctuation, where the children haven't realized they've done 2 sentences and haven't democrated those properly. And I think sentence fragments, where actually the students are writing a sentence and they forget to put the verb in or something like that. And so I know it's almost in like a beta phase as far as I kind of, from my interpretation. I don't think they use that phrase, but that seems to be the interpretation that I get right now, where they're trialing certain amount of resources. There's lessons, slides, there's CPD on how to avoid things like run-on sentences and making sure children avoid fragments, etc. And there's also resources with plenty of multiple choice questions. The idea is you do that typical before and after to kind of have a look at the progress. And I think it's, to be part of it, you then have to agree that you give that data back to normal marking, and with that they'll do some technical wizardry and be able to tell us a bit more about how effective the CPD is. And I can kind of see how they're going to take that then one step further and move on to the next thing, the next possible highest leverage thing, but also keep on improving that CPD offer as well. It's kind of like optional, but you don't have to pay extra. So as long as you pay extra because there are 2 almost kind of two versions of no more marking. Anyone can sign up for no more marking right now, and you can kind of do an inter-school judgment or an inter-trust judgment, and you can do that free of charge, because it's just the algorithm that works behind the scenes. If you buy into no more marking, what you're effectively buying into are those national tasks that Adam talks about earlier, which means that you can then compare your cohorts, nationally at that kind of point in time. And if you go for that option, which is, don't believe it's crazily expensive, you get those additional writing resources with them as well.
Yeah, it's called the Writing Hub, is the name of the resources that are there. Yeah, I think we've been part of that research project. I know that they've definitely been doing a before and after to look at the effectiveness of it. I'm sure that that quite back to basics approach will be very helpful, because I know how many run-on sentences my year fives are capable of putting into a piece of comparative judgment. So
when you were talking about the type of writing, especially when you talked about when you weren't sure if you were gaming the system, what you were doing, from what I could hear, was you were supporting children in writing the way, for instance, Christopher Such might advocate writing, looking at things on a sentence by sentence level and on a paragraph level, rather than the whole piece. Because if you have that level of detail and attention to what you're writing, I think your piece is going to be more impactful, whether you've been taught it before you're doing your comparative judgment or not.
I think I agree, and I think also it's much more relevant to how we actually write as adults. Not necessarily talking about writing creatively, but writing in terms of thinking about constructing an email. I was late for this recording because I got stuck in traffic in London, and I suddenly reread some of the messages that I sent you, Kieran, earlier, and I was like, gosh, if I read these, I could see these. Actually, I was slightly worried they come across as quite rude if you read them in a certain tone of voice, or flippant, even though I was quite upset about being late. And it's that sort of thing. It's that awareness of your tone and your awareness of how to write. Like I say, not writing a piece, but constructing formal, informal sentences, constructing instructional sentences, constructing informative sentences. That's actually far more relevant as a writing skill than the ability to write beautiful flowing prose with lots of synonyms, which and reported speech. So I'm quite in favor of that kind of thing. But then I've always been much more at ease teaching non-fiction writing than teaching fiction writing. I get quite excited when we do a comparative judgment task that has a non-fiction stimulus, because I think it's actually, well, I'm applying my own personal biases here, but I think it's more fun for them to write. We actually trialed using comparative judgment to do our science assessments. So we got students to write an essay in science. And I had, that for me, teaching that kind of writing is brilliant, because I just love teaching precise writing. I like teaching writing that is academic. I like teaching writing that is quite formulaic in a way, sort of writing revolution stuff, topic sentences, and constructing really concise paragraphs. I've spoken quite a lot before about how I think a lot of primary writing is, politely to put it, flabby, or florid, or there's so many lovely children in my class who are very much under the impression that they're absolutely brilliant writers, and I think that they might be, but they're not precise writers. And they love a synonym, and they've been taught, and I think this is not uncommon in any primary setting, that the real height of the real writer's tool, the alchemy for writing is the thesaurus, and if they can master the thesaurus, then they can master the world, without really knowing any of the subtleties of the differences between the synonyms that they find in the thesaurus. I've gone off on one there, so it doesn't take much, does it? But yeah, that precision is something that I really am keen to teach, but also to learn more about how we teach that.
If you want to write at an academic level or at a high level, the more precise you are, the better received that will be, and the more effective it will be for whatever purpose it might be. If you're writing a journal article, if you're writing an academic paper, you need to say 80,000 words worth of material in about maybe 5,000 words, and so I think anything that prepares pupils for that world is all right by me. Are there any other things, Neil, that you think we should do to get the most from comparative judgment?
Certainly in my early experience of it, it was used as a really nice summative form of assessment, which I would argue is its main benefit. And I know you have to be very cautious about trying to use one assessment for both summative and formative reasons, but I certainly think you can think of a few. Once you've done a judgment, you get all your scripts back and you get a select highlight of I think it's like the top 5% and a middle 5% and the bottom 5% nationally as well. And so what you can then do is then really kind of think about, right, well, what made these so good, and equally, what didn't make these so great? And you can then think about, well, how does that impact my teaching in the medium term? You might then think about, actually, well, how do I need to think about and consider the English curriculum and what we're actually teaching, and say maybe spending that 3.5 weeks on simile and metaphor isn't useful, because actually what the top writers are doing, they aren't using simile or metaphor, but they are actually just writing really well and accurately and with precision. And so spend some time on that. So I think there's quite a lot of work that you can do after the judgment has been made, where you can kind of, certainly if you're an English lead within a school or an English lead working across a trust, you can kind of have a look and, what are we doing well, what are we not doing well, and where can we improve, and kind of think about putting CPD in place to put those improvements in there. And that's kind of something that I rarely used it for. When I started to use it, I just kind of thought, oh yeah, great, we've got the results are back in. Isn't this nice to know that we're not the worst school, but we're certainly not the best school? You also get trends. So obviously the system uses data from your MIS. So you get a comparison between free school meals, non-free school meals, boys v girls, etc., etc. And so that's quite an interesting bit of data that you also get from there. And again, they do produce confidence intervals. So if there's if there's quite a bit of overlap, then fine. But if you're seeing some significant differences there, it may mean that you want to look at certain provision. One thing I wish they would do was like a summer born versus non-summer born, because I think that would be quite an interesting something to look at, both nationally and kind of within the school system. But certainly thinking about that data and using that data pack that comes towards the end is really effective. And especially, as I say, I've always enjoyed giving the middle 5 that they send nationally and the top 5 that they send nationally, almost using that as a starter activity with staff afterwards, being like, which 5 do you think were the best, which 5 do you think are the middle, and be able to explain your reasons why, because it just gets staff thinking about it as well, that little bit more deeply.
The data pack is a thing of beauty. I mean, we get it sort of gifted to us, like a physical copy of it, when there's been a national judging window, and it has all those beautiful graphs with confidence intervals and things like that. And like Neil says, you can see you can see when your free school meals aren't doing as well as your other students and things like that. And so I really enjoy getting that pack, and I have to be honest, I do quite enjoy the ranking. I do like to see who my top 5 are, and whether I agree with that judgment.
And if you've been using no more marking for long enough on that national scale, they can trace that pupils back. So you can actually see that you can produce individual progress reports for each child or each kind of year group as they've kind of progressed through schooling. So you can kind of have a look and see, and then again, compare that progress to the national average progress as well. So again, really kind of quite interesting, useful information. Again, you get that progress by gender, you get that progress by free school meals and pupil premium, etc. So yeah, it really makes it quite interesting idea. We talk about, and I know James Pembroke talks about, well, actually, can we actually measure progress with the amount of data that you're kind of producing through this, for this data to be created? I'd say it's as pretty close as you're ever going to be able to get it.
It feels like there was a period of time not too long ago when we were having conversations of we will never be able to accurately judge writing. T is so subjective, and I think what Daisy's done here is come up with the best sort of system for that. That's why I'm so keen on it, because I think it's an imperfect system, but I think this is the closest we'll ever come to kind of something akin to the NFER tests in terms of confidence for judgment. I'd be interested to speak to secondary school teachers who are using this and see whether there's correlation between the kind of skills that you need to pass an English language paper and how this links in with the writing curriculum in Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4, because like I say, it does require a certain shift of focus in your Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 writing curriculum. Not anything major, nothing radical, but just sort of, we did sit down as a school and think, well, if this is how we're going to be judging writing, then we need to think about how we're teaching writing. Not to model it to the assessment method, but just that we're no longer going to be producing things that tick boxes. We're going to be producing pieces of work that make an impact and are written for an audience.
Certainly the savviest secondary teachers listen to this podcast, so let's make that happen, where we get someone in with you, Adam, and we talk about how the two processes marry up across phases. That's definitely something I think very interesting to explore. We've alluded at times already to this next question. What should we avoid when engaged with comparative judgment?
Handwriting. It's handwriting. Last year I had a greater depth writer, just superb writer, really accurate, really precise, really nice writing, really like a good writer. Okay, and I'm sure they're doing really well at secondary school at the moment. Very bright child. And they came out, I think they came out the bottom end of expected standard when we did our comparative judgment. And, I said there's very rarely any surprises. And I wasn't surprised that they came out there, but it was purely because they have chicken scratch handwriting. And I mean, really, really, it really was quite remarkably illegible. And that bias towards poor handwriting equals poor quality writing is impossible to escape. I have sat through probably the best side of like 2 or 3 hours of CPD on actually probably more than that, including the original CPD I did with Daisy. So maybe like 5 or 6 hours of CPD on how best to do comparative judgment. And I still have to consciously look past handwriting. And I think if I'm doing, we do 6 at a time, sort of towards the end of a term. And if I'm maybe on my 6th one, then it's totally possible that making judgments based on handwriting is going to happen. Yeah, I mean, I know we aspire that all students would have legible handwriting, but we have to detach the quality of their writing from the presentation of their writing. And unfortunately, comparative judgment, if it's done by teachers, particularly who are perhaps untrained or tired or any of these things, it is always going to come back to nice looking work taking precedent over high quality work.
It sounds like, some of those fail safes you were mentioning earlier on, Neil, that they are the kind of things that might support us and overcome, because like you say, Adam, you're never going to overcome these biases that are sort of fundamental to being human. But I reckon it's easier to overcome handwriting bias than it is to overcome the biases that are associated with the subjective assessment of writing.
So I think my only concern with that is the handwriting bias so inbuilt in the sort of broader base of teachers doing the judgments, that if you genuinely didn't have that handwriting bias, if you were saying these pieces of writing were terrible handwriting but high quality writing are great, and everyone else said they were terrible, that you would actually get personally a lower confidence score as a result of that. But the good thing, I mean, I make a lot of fuss about this handwriting issue. generally speaking, there is a correlation between poor handwriting and poor quality writing. You know, I don't think that's that controversial to say that. There's a correlation. It's not always, there are always going to be outliers on either side of that correlation. But it's just having had that personal experience of this student who consistently came back low end of expected standard, when I knew from reading their English book or their history book or anything else. But then you know, we use it. We don't input the raw score as their progress score. So I would always put them down as a greater depth writer in Insight, which we use for our data tracking, because I know them and I'm their teacher. So it's that there is that extra level of moderation, and I think that comes to the point that I think I heard discussed when this was discussed on the podcast last time, is the idea of replacing the writing sats with comparative judgment. That student would have come out as low expected standard for writing. So I don't know, really. I'm not sure. I can't decide whether the handwriting is a fatal flaw or whether it's such a rare occurrence to have a student who has terrible handwriting and excellent writing that it's unimportant and it's not worth throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
So I think there are probably like 2 points to that. One is quite harsh, and is one of my unpopular opinions, where unless there's a physical need, that, you know, we write for purposes, we write for an audience, and if your audience can't read your handwriting, then you've fundamentally failed at the art of communication. And so I do agree there is a handwriting bias, but I kind of think that more needs to be done to look at it as well. The other part, and I'm hoping, and I did mention this last time as well, is that I'm hoping within like 5 years, I'm sure people who have like modern day smartphones, you can use your camera to scan a piece of text, handwritten text, and then it's pretty good at converting it into regular print, as in on a computer. If no more marking could somehow, put, and with the amount of writing that they probably do have, they probably have enough data points to create some sort of artificial intelligence. That means as it gets scanned into their system, the mainframe can, warts and all, mistakes and everything, should convert that handwriting into something that's relatively legible in print, and that gets done that for every piece of writing. That's kind of one way they could think about reducing that handwriting bias, I think.
That's this. I mean, this student in particular, we did a lot of handwriting intervention, but it really was illegible, and I really feel like that will be an epoch-making moment in the history of computing, when a computer is able to read a piece of text that he has written. It's almost like a Turing test. If you spend long enough, you can understand what he was trying to say, but I don't think that a computer ever will be able to do that.
5 or 10 years, I hope. Mark that date down, Kieran. We'll have the 3 R's, and we'll have no more mark, comparative judgment, computers powerful enough to work all that out.
I think whenever there are computers that powerful, then we've got bigger problems than the level of handwriting in our classes. We should be saying our goodbyes, I think. When I was listening to you, Adam, I was thinking, oh my goodness, yeah, if you're the only person, if you're the outlier saying that this is good handwriting or this is good writing, and everyone else is judging based on the handwriting, then that totally flips that system. I was like scales from my eyes moment. I think the fact that it's possible, I think you're right to worry about it and to consider it. Are there any other pitfalls? So we've mentioned time, we've mentioned handwriting. Is there anything else you guys think is really important?
The only other one I would say, and I've seen it happen a few times, is when schools try to merge no more marking, comparative judgment with elements of the teacher assessment framework. And so by that, I mean, they are bringing, checklists have been made for teachers as they're going through, do they have those hyphens? Do they have the commas for parenthesis? Do they have subordinate clauses to start a sentence? And that really just kind of defies the purpose of it. It really is just, you just have to read it and decide what is best. And if you're so used to that old school moderating where you're going through pieces and pieces, being like, come on, I need one more example of a hyphenated word somewhere for me to be able to give you that working at judgment. And you go into this with that kind of mindset where you're really trying to find that level of grammatical detail, you are defeating the purpose completely of what the whole thing is about, and you're only wasting your money by using comparative judgment, because that's not how the other X number of teachers are doing it. So it's not how it needs to be done. It's just purely which one do you think is right. But I've sat through a few meetings where we've discussed checklists for teachers to use whilst they're doing that judgment to look for specific punctuation, grammar features, etc.
I think for me, there's an increase in confidence in the accuracy of comparative, or not necessarily that the accuracy, no, in the graininess of the data as we go up through the year groups. So for example, a year one comparative judgment task will probably give you a good idea of whether a student is greater depth, expected standard working towards, or not even that necessarily, but whether they're kind of writing at an age appropriate level, basically. Whereas a year six task actually can be really quite interesting in looking at the intricacies and the different, having a higher, well, basically looking at their writing age and looking at that. Looking at months there, looking at kind of 6 months between two certain students, and why is this student 6 months below this one, rather than saying, again, in year one that a student might be literate or not quite. And that's because a lot of the year one tasks that I've judged, and perhaps some of the year two tasks as well, you're often comparing two pieces of, as Neil says, like mark making, or you're comparing scribbles, or you're comparing very, very, very short pieces of writing, or writing that is completely off topic or something like that. That's the nature of writing in year one, is that students are at very different levels with it. And so ultimately, when you're looking towards the lower end of that scale, comparing two different pieces of mark making and saying which is the better writing is a completely pointless task, because neither is the better writing, it's just mark making. So yeah, I would say that's something that we've also thought about. And I would say if I was a Key Stage 1 teacher, I'd probably pay less attention to comparative judgment. I feel like in year 5 and 6, it's quite a big event when it comes around, and perhaps in year 1 and 2, it's slightly more. This is an interesting bit of data, and it tells us fundamentally, who our most confident writers are and who our least confident ones are. But you probably are fully aware of that already anyway. So
I mean, it's been fascinating talking to you guys about comparative judgment. Before I let you go, though, are there any experiences that you think that it would help those who are listening to share in them with you? Anything that's happened, things they might want to, learn from. Is there anything that really stands out? There doesn't have to be.
I would just say Daisy usually does free webinars to evidently entice people and get more schools to sign up, and more schools that sign up, the more reliable hopefully the judgments are going to be. They're normally about half an hour, 40 minutes. And if you're just thinking about, I need something else right now to help us think about writing, it's not going to be a waste of time, I don't think. Also, there is, if you want to think about how it works, and you can see how it works, there's plenty. If you want to see how it works in practice, I think on their website, when you first search for it, or one of the first elements of their website, you can do a comparative judgment against colors, and the contrast between the colors decreases as time goes on. So you can kind of have that experience of ranking something, so you can see what it's like. So you get a bit of experience with it before. And only if you want to perhaps not listen to Daisy, but read more about it. She writes about it towards the end of Making Good Progress. It's all algorithm based, and the algorithm, I think, is it's available. It's a free algorithm. Anyone can go and find this, and if you were savvy enough, could make it. It's not much more than that, as in what's going on behind it. But yeah, really interesting read at the end of Making Good Progress about how she feels that it can work within a curriculum as the progression model for assessment.
I was really fortunate to have some in-person training with Daisy in a school in South London back in, just like I say, just marginally before COVID. And it wasn't a sales pitch. It was all people who had already bought into the system. It was designed for teachers who are new to using comparative judgment like myself. But I really appreciated how much detail Daisy went into, and how she explained the entire system and the rationale behind it, and how they were, basically the confidence that they had in their results. And I think ultimately that is the most appealing part of this, is that on the whole, it's a really accurate system. It's quite remarkable that you put in one singular piece of writing from a student in your class that's done under quite unusual, an unseen stimulus is quite that's not how you'd write something in an English lesson. And yet it comes back with a list that I ultimately agree with in probably 95% of cases, and even that 5% is usually quite a small movement up and down. I think from memory, the last time that we sat as a year group and looked at 60 children, I think we probably changed fewer than 3 or 4 of the judgments, in terms of like they're out of those 3 sort of where they are related to their age standard. And that's really appealing for me as someone who likes data, but also someone who likes reducing workload, but also someone who likes to have a system that is the most reliable, even though, as we've said, there are some flaws that are still inherent, but those flaws can also be addressed with better CPD in the school. And I think we've been quite proactive in having CPD recently, looking at why we do comparative judgment, reminding people of that. But I don't really, I think the one big flaw if you're a literacy lead is that you will spend a lot of your life chasing people up saying, have you done your comparative judgment? Have you done your comparative? I searched earlier, we were looking for one of the reports, and I searched at my email inbox for comparative judgment, and it's literally just 50 emails from our head of assessment saying, just a reminder everyone that our comparative judgment window closes on Wednesday, just a reminder everyone. So actually quite often when it's our big end of half term, instead of having we usually have a CPD meeting on a Tuesday, everyone sits in their classroom and does 6 comparative judgment tasks. So that's probably the biggest practical consideration for it.
You get the judgment windows pretty far in advance, so if you can give a staff meeting for staff to get it done, do that, because then you're guaranteed for it to be done in a way that's not then rushed towards the end, because it is one of those things that seems like, oh yeah, I'm only going to do 5-10 minutes at the end of the day. It rarely, from my experience, it rarely happens like that. It's you need to give teachers a block of time to get it done. So Kieran, we started out trying to find 5 ways that we could get the most out of comparative judgment. How did we do?
I think we did it, Neil. It was fascinating listening to you guys talking about this, and part of me wishes I was involved in this more. One of my schools utilizes comparative judgment, but because I've got solely a mathematics focus, I don't get to engage with writing as much as I used to. But I think if we want to get the most out of comparative judgment, we use it and the information that we get from it as a supplement, looking in more detail at the pieces that we provide. We talk about how to write impactful writing, or be more explicit about how to create more impactful writing. We consider the formative uses, for instance, what the resources are telling us about common weaknesses, so we can utilize those in whole class feedback, whole school feedback if we're leads, and focusing staff thinking on common errors across their classes in our schools. We should utilize the comparison of data on a national scale, and we should consciously look past handwriting when engaged in the act of comparative judgment. I think if we do that, it sounds like we've got a really good model for getting the most from this and assessing writing as accurately as is humanly possible at this time. Around Christmas time, I would like to do comparative judgment of the first 100 episodes of TDaPE to see if Christopher Such's reading episode comes out top on that as it does on the listens. Would you be up for that, Adam? Would you join us for it?
We'll talk to Daisy about seeing whether you can utilize the do your own little internal judgment on it and see what happens.
Yeah, because they've done it with things like that before, haven't they? With interesting things, haven't they?
I think you could probably, trying to think, it probably wouldn't be that hard to find because you can do it. There's been, a lot of those like World Cups that they were doing on Twitter a while ago, a couple of years ago. It's essentially the same principle, it's not really the same principle, but, I'm sure there's some sort of system or program on GitHub or something that could be used where we all have to decide which is the more interesting episode out of 2 episodes until we find out what the problem is. Then is that you will end up with the least interesting episode. So that's the worry. I think we focus on the positive.
Something to think about. All that's left to say is thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much, Adam.
Thank you, Kieran.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you, Kieran. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Neil.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.